Venezuela is a South American nation located in the north of the continent. It borders Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, as well as some small island nations on its exclusive economic zone. The nation's history is rife with revolutions, declarations of independence, and both successful and failed coups d'etats. For the purpose of this video, we will only be taking a hard look at three of these political upheavals, the first of which began in 1819. In 1819, the Congress of Angostura proclaimed through the fundamental law of the Republic of Colombia the foundation of a new state, dubbed Gran Colombia. Gran Colombia was a collection of territories including present-day Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Venezuela, and parts of Peru, Guyana, and even Brazil. This made it the largest South American nation to declare independence from Spain, or any European power for that matter. America was the second government to recognize their independence, and it was the first former Spanish colony recognized by the US. The first order of business for the new state, even before writing its constitution, was to appoint Simón Bolívar to the presidency. Simón Bolívar is a key figure in Venezuelan history and South American history in general. He fought the colonialists across the continent both before and after the establishment of Gran Colombia. Bolivar secured freedom and independence for countless people, and in this way, Gran Colombia was somewhat a realization of his efforts. An interesting thing to note here is that John Quincy Adams, who at the time was Secretary of State of the United States and would later become president, called Gran Colombia one of the most powerful nations on the planet. This proclamation not only served to antagonize America's European adversaries, but also bolstered Bolivar's near legendary ethos. Simón Bolívar attempted to lead the new country as president until 1830 when he resigned power due to his failure to maintain it. The nation was marred with physical and political conflict for essentially the entirety of its existence, and only lasted for a year without Bolívar before being dissolved. While Bolívar had liberated Venezuela decades earlier, the dissolution of Gran Colombia marked the true beginning of Venezuelan independence. After Venezuela left Gran Colombia, their relationship with the US didn't skip a beat, but diplomacy was really pretty boring at this time. Both nations were working on solidifying their state, and the Civil War would soon start in the US. 70 years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, Venezuela turned to the US for defense from Britain, Germany, and Italy, who were blockading the nation with their navies. While the US refused to support them militarily, the US helped them secure a compromise with the blockading nations that ended the blockade. Sadly, 2 years after this, it became apparent that the president, Cipriano Castro, would not fulfill the prior agreements, and that just caused more friction between the United States and Venezuela. Now let's jump ahead another 50 years to 1953, when dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez assumed power in the form of a dictatorship following a coup 3 years earlier. During this time, Venezuela experienced an economic boom due to their vast oil reserves, which are the largest in the world. Unfortunately for Venezuela, their boom was exploited by various American energy companies due to the dictator accepting bribes from the companies. The US awarded him the Legion of Merit for his support of the American economy. When he finally left office and abandoned the country, following a coup of course, a massive torture and murder operation that his security forces were conducting was revealed. The US didn't give out any awards for this policy. Now that we're caught up on the foundation of Venezuela and the limited interactions between it and the United States, we can start talking about the next big political upheaval. This happened at the start of the 21st century, well specifically 1998, when Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela for the first time in a landslide victory. After his election, he immediately nationalized the oil industry of the nation, even overturning the privatization of the now state-owned oil company PDVSA. With its massive amounts of oil and practically all the profits going to the government, it's no wonder that the Chavez administration was flush with cash. Hugo Chavez used its wealth to fund a large amount of social programs like education, housing, and health services. These changes were great for Venezuelans and caused great improvements in literacy, workforce quality, and healthcare quality. But the United States was still wary of socialism and viewed it as the path to communism. However, economic policy wasn't a huge factor in the opposition to Venezuela, as trade with the United States was sustained at a decent amount throughout Chavez's presidency. What concerned the US was Chavez's relationship to other nations. When George W. Bush took office in 2001, the United States' relationship with Venezuela deteriorated rapidly. The United States took issue with the very cozy and very public relationship that Hugo Chavez maintained with the dictator of Cuba, Fidel Castro. In addition to this, while Venezuela held the presidency of OPEC, Chavez traveled to all 10 OPEC countries, including Iraq. This made him the first head of state to meet Saddam Hussein since the Gulf War, which is obviously received poorly in America. It's important to note that Venezuelans didn't support this either. While we're talking about OPEC, years later in 2004, Venezuela would push the oil-producing nations in the organization to lower their production, which drove oil prices up globally, and up to $25 a barrel in the United States. While this would come later, the start of the Bush administration was also marred by trade slights from Venezuela. Even though the US-Venezuela trade relationship was never really harmed, the political statements made with these moves would drive a wedge between the United States and Venezuela. These moves included things like expanding their trading relationship with Cuba and importing arms from Russia. In response, the United States attempted to block arms deals to Venezuela from countries like Israel, Brazil, and Spain. Around this time, there was also a coup in Venezuela, which Chavez accused the United States of supporting. This incident is referred to as the Laguno Overpass events, and it was a shootout between the Caracas police and a pro-government organization called the Bolivarian Circles. While I won't go into depth, a protest had started due to anger about Hugo Chavez's plans for the state-owned oil company PDVSA. The protest grew and intensified into a call for the removal of Hugo Chavez, so they marched towards the presidential palace. Unfortunately for everyone, the pro-government Chavistas had already begun gathering at the palace in anticipation of the protest. The Chavistas blocked all routes towards the presidential palace, and the Bolivarian circles overlooked the Laguno overpass. The protesters and Chavistas clashed, and as the police attempted to separate the two sides, gunfire broke out between the city police and the Bolivarian circles. This resulted in the deaths of 19 people and left 127 injured. Some military officers had been plotting a coup attempt and used the civil unrest to arrest Chavez and remove him from power. Some guy named Pedro Carmona declared himself to be president, but nobody really liked his policies, and there was also massive demonstrations being held in support of Chavez, so he became president again after only a couple weeks out of power. It is important to note that the short-lived spontaneous Venezuelan government was acknowledged by the United States, and they had been funding some of the organizations behind the coup. Once Chavez was returned to power, he made it clear that the US was complicit in his removal. He severed ties with the American military, expelled the US Navy commander, and claimed that the United States was plotting to overthrow him. During the remainder of the Bush administration, relations just continued to deteriorate, with Chavez calling President Bush a jackass and saying that a podium the president had used a day earlier still smelled of sulfur, and later would say Obama shares the stench. Chavez had established himself as an anti-American force in the region, along with Venezuela as a whole. When Obama was elected in 2008, Venezuela initially seemed optimistic that relations could improve between the countries, but relations quickly regressed again after Obama criticized Chavez's relationship with Iran and Cuba. Regardless, the two presidents did eventually meet, and Chavez claimed he wanted to become Obama's friend. This relationship was really kind of odd and inconsistent, and never really went anywhere. Chavez would later call Obama a disgrace to black people and claim that America is the most terroristic nation in history. Nothing really notable happened during these 5 years, and Hugo Chavez eventually died of cancer in 2013. Following the death of Chavez, the third political upheaval we'll talk about had begun. Chavez had chosen a successor prior to passing, and Nicolas Maduro quickly assumed office after his death. He assumed office in April, but his first engagements with the US began in the fall, when Maduro accused US diplomats of sabotage and expelled 3 of them from the nation. The US then responded in kind, expelling 3 Venezuelan diplomats themselves. Maduro declared that while the government of the United States does not understand that it has to respect our country's sovereignty, there will simply be no cordial relations nor cordial communication. Pretty much the same thing would happen just months later in February. Around this time, economic turmoil in Venezuela had begun to intensify. I won't go into detail about this because it's well known these days, but even at the beginning, the global community had recognized the conditions in the nation as a crisis. Due to this, in addition to the antagonization of America and their relationships with American enemies, the US began to apply economic and political pressure to Venezuela in the form of sanctions. Sanctions were mostly targeted towards individuals around this time, focused on people who were responsible for the mistreatment of protesters and government officials. These sanctions were denounced by Venezuela, of course, but also by a collection of other South American nations. Relations just weren't going anywhere, and Obama's presidency was wrapping up. Trump would soon take office. With the election of President Trump and the always worsening Venezuela crisis, Trump took a hard stance on what was now effectively a dictatorship in Venezuela. In addition to increasing sanctions on the aforementioned individuals, the Trump administration expanded sanctions to include Venezuelan companies, people involved in the drug trade, and members of Maduro's inner circle. In addition to the sanctions, Trump refused to rule out a military option in regards to Venezuela, which obviously inflamed tensions to all-time highs with the Maduro regime. In January of 2019, Juan Guaido declared himself president of Venezuela, following the massive protests in the country. Guaido was recognized by America and a substantial amount of Western nations, but some countries like China and Russia continued to support Maduro for geopolitical gain. In response to the United States recognizing Guaido's government, Maduro cut off diplomacy with the United States entirely. With Venezuela on the brink of civil war and experiencing rolling blackouts across the nation, as well as a lack of food and water, and an incredible political destabilization, the Maduro regime has stubbornly dug into the nation. It seems few options are left for the Venezuelan people, and the international community is split on who should be leading the country, leaving the nation at a political standstill. The relationship between these countries is decisively bad, and until massive political reforms are undertaken in Venezuela, that's unlikely to change. I'm not sure where the situation in Venezuela is going or how it will end, but it's a certainty that we'll find out. Thanks for watching, and as always, make sure to subscribe and like the video. If you have any subjects you'd like me to cover in the future, or any recommendations to improve my videos, leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.